Hi everyone! In this video, I'm going to go over some techniques I use to shadow and highlight shapes with watercolors and gouache. Now, gouache is basically an opaque watercolor, and you can use a lot of water with it to shear it out like watercolor, or you can add very little water to keep it opaque. And that's why I prefer gouache, because I really enjoy this versatility and this ability to cover and layer, more opaque, lighter colors on top of darker colors to get the effects and textures that I want in my illustrations. Okay. I'm going to be doing this demo with both watercolor and gouache. The burnt sienna and the more red shades are going to be the gouache, and then the blue turquoisey samples are going to be done in watercolor. And I will have a list of all the supplies I used in this video in the description box below. This is how I approach mixing colors. Okay, I know there are a lot of color theorists, purists who will hate me, but this is my simplified way of doing matching fabric colors and creating highlight colors and shadow colors when I'm just doing, design illustration work. Okay. I take my fabric swatch that I'm trying to match up, and I mix a color with my gouache or watercolor, or a combination thereof, that is the shadow color for that fabric. Okay? So if my swatch is a deep cherry red, then I mix a darker version of that deep cherry red. And then I take that color and I separate it out into separate wells in my palette, and I create different dilutions. Okay? I add a little bit of water so that one will match the base color of my fabric, in the middle one, and then I'll create an even lighter one if my fabric requires any kind of highlights. And, sometimes I'll create two different shadow tones. Because you guys know at this point, if you've been watching this series, that I like having more than one shadow tone most of the time. So I mix my colors, have my dilutions. I am always testing on scrap. For this demo, I'm going to test right on my paper, but for illustrations, I always test on a separate sheet of paper, and that paper is always the same exact branded everything paper as my final, because everything looks different, reacts different on different papers. I mean, why do you think illustrators have brand preferences when it comes to paper? Because things act differently. Sometimes colors read differently. So always, whether you're working with marker, color pencil, paint, whatever, always have a test of the same exact paper you're using for your final. The number one rule of trying to get flat, smooth application of a block of color, like this turquoise cylinder, is to have everything be wet at the same time and be dry at the same time. And when things start drying in patches, that's when you start getting weird separation lines and streakiness. Okay? And then you're letting things dry, overlapping colors, and then you get patches where things are darker. No. You want to use a large enough brush. And I know some of you guys are scared about that because you're afraid of going outside the lines, like I did make a little tiny mistake there. But you have to practice. you know, you have to practice with a fatter brush. And, you know, I do like the round brushes because you can use a fat brush, but it'll still have a very pointy tip. And make sure that if you are painting a large shape, that you are using, you know, you have the fat paintbrush that's holding enough paint in it for you to cover the whole surface in one go, you know, each section at a time. So in this case with the cylinders, each cylinder at a time. If I'm painting clothes, you know, let's say I have a skirt with 4 panels. Then I will paint each panel separately so that I can get that everything wet at the same time and dry at the same time for each panel. And everything will dry all one color, nice, flat, and smooth. When I choose brushes, I have a lot of brushes, okay? And when I am doing my painting, my preference is for authentic sable brushes. And yes, they are pricey, but they are an investment. I still have the same exact brushes that I bought in college. And college was a long time ago for me, and I paint a lot. But I take care of my things, and they're very good quality, and so they still work great. The reason why I like authentic is they hold more water. And so, remember I was just talking about how you want enough paint, enough watercolor in your brush to cover the whole surface of the thing you're trying to paint? Yeah, that's when that comes in handy. I do have cheap artificial brushes like the one I'm using right now for mixing because the bristles, you know, they don't hold as much water, they don't hold as much paint. The bristles are stiff and I think they're made out of nylon, and I use them for mixing. I don't want to use my nice sable brushes just to mix and grind and swirl. Okay, so I use my cheapy little brushes for that. And, you know, sometimes I end up painting with them, and then I will at some point be like, what am I doing? What am I doing? But yeah, for the most part, I reserve them mostly for mixing. Do you see how I keep running out of paint and I keep having to go back in? And I have to work fast because I don't want parts to start drying before I'm done painting the whole cone. And that is partially because this is a much smaller brush. I think it's a size 6. And partially because I'm using a nylon watercolor brush instead of my authentic sable. And it was kind of patchy before, so now I'm going in again. The easiest and for me the most often used method to shadow is wet on dry. And by that I mean wet paint on top of dry paper. So I've waited for my cylinder to dry completely, the first coat, and then I put my shadow tone on top. If you watch any of my marker tutorials, you know, I say this over and over again. I take the base color and I just choose a slightly darker color to shadow when I want to keep the vibrancy of the color, which is what I'm doing here. So it's the same color, but the base color just has more water in it to make it lighter. So I'm painting it down. And if you don't like the strong demarcation, you can take a clean brush, put a little water on it, and soften that edge up by diluting a little bit of that shadow color so it transitions a little bit more gently. Another way you can approach it is to take quite a dark shadow color, a little bit, on a skinnier brush, and I start, you know how sometimes I have the darkest shadows in the center of the shadow? I start with that, and then I start blending out with a little bit of water. So here I am putting in the darkest shadow. This is actually a little bit too dark because I'm going to be blending it out. Clean out my brush. Okay. My water is going to start getting really dirty, but just FYI, you should be clearing out your water, especially in between colors. But I took a clean brush with a little bit of water in it, nothing too wet, otherwise the paint will go everywhere. And I blend it out. And in between, you see, I rinse my brush clean of water, and then I wipe out a lot of the excess water with a paper towel, and then I kind of blend and kind of scoop away some of that paint to create a more gradual blended shadow. Now I'm going back to the first cylinder. Now that that first shadow is dry, I'm going to go in with a second shadow color, because you know that's my jam, multiple shadows. And I wanted to wait for the previous layers to dry so that I can really get the strength of this color. If I just keep adding darker colors to wet paper, it just blends out kind of messily. And in this way, even if I soften and blend the edges a little bit, I'm still getting that concentrated color in the center, and it's a little bit easier to control. Another technique you can use to create more blended shadows and highlights is wet on wet technique, which is literally wet things on top of other wet things. So what you do is you take some water, and for the purposes of this demo, I'm using slightly dirty water so you can see where I'm putting down water. Okay, when you are working, you can like tilt your head a little bit to see the shine of the water and where you're painting. Just because you can't see it, like if you use clean water, just because you can't see it doesn't mean you can just lay water anywhere. Because later, when you lay down the paint is going to go anywhere where there's water. It's just going to start spreading. And so if you have water everywhere, it's going to spread everywhere. And so you want to take your water and keep it contained in the areas you want colored. You see how it just started spreading the second I laid down some paint? When you do this effect, you're going to have to start with more opaque, more concentrated, darker paint. Because you see how I was using the same paint as I was painting with the cone, but because there's already so much water on the paper, it comes off so much lighter. Okay, so keep that in mind. To create the highlight, I take a brush that has the water all squeezed out, and I run it across the paint to pick up whatever liquid is sitting on top of my paper. And then I take a darker color and I lay down the shadow, and wow, look at that go. That went a little bit crazy. I'm gonna warn you now. This is a slightly more difficult technique than some of the other ones I'm showing you in this video. If any of my former students are watching, they're probably rolling their eyes so hard at me right now because I just announced the understatement of the year. Every time I teach wet on wet technique in my advanced illustration class, everyone pretty much hates me. Just they come back the following week and they're like, if we never do wet on wet technique again, that would be great, Zoe. But you know what? It does produce nice results. It's a technique worth teaching, and it's a technique worth learning. And here on this cone, I'm just going to demonstrate, a one color graphic, unblended shadow. This one here I call dry on dry because this is when you take a completely dry painted shape like this brown cylinder and you shadow it using dry media like color pencils. And This is probably the easiest technique because you have the control of the color pencil, but then you have the beautiful pigmentation of the gouache underneath it. And, you know, I have a whole video on shading techniques with color pencil that you can check out for help on this part. But yeah, I'm using 2 different colors to get the more intense shadows and everything, and I'm blending them out. I wouldn't recommend you use any of the rubbing alcohol or baby oil techniques that I teach in the color pencil video. But this is quite a nice look, and the thing is, it does leave a texture. I mean, you can blend very carefully, but really it does leave a texture. And so I never recommend this technique for anything you want to look super smooth, like skin. Like, look how hairy and rough that looks. Okay, most of the time you don't want your figures to look like they have rough, hairy skin. Right? So I wouldn't use this technique for skin, but I definitely use this technique for suede, something that has that nubby, fuzzy texture to it without it being hairy, right? Suede is not, it has, you can see little hairs, but it's not like furry. It's fuzzy. And so anytime I want that fuzzy look, certain kinds of knits, suedes, I will do this effect where no matter what media I use for the base, marker, gouache, watercolor, I will shadow and highlight using dry media to create that texture. And to have the texture of a cold pressed paper, like the one I'm using right now, also adds to the texture. But you know, even with smooth paper, like hot press watercolor paper, you will get that textured effect. Not as much, but you'll still get it. And depending on how you manipulate your pencil. This white one here is white charcoal pencil, which shows up more strongly than most color pencils. The number one rule I want you guys to remember about charcoal pencils is do not layer them with color pencils. I have not tried every single brand of color pencil out there, but the ones I have tried, they do not mix well together. They are not friends. Sometimes I just want a tiny little slice of highlight, so I will use a white gel pen, but longtime viewers know that gel pen is really not my favorite choice ever, and if I can use anything else, I will opt for that instead. There are some times where gel pen is the only choice, and I get sad. But if I do want a strong white painted highlight, I will use white gouache. Okay. White watercolor is typically not opaque enough to cover darker colors. White gouache will. Even diluted, look at that. It's a little bit diluted, still the white is very strong. And that just looks a little bit crazy. Like, it doesn't even look like a highlight, it looks like a white stripe. So I will take a kind of dry-ish brush and soften the edges. A dry-ish brush, I wipe that down with a paper towel. The gouache is still wet on my cylinder so that I can kind of fuzz and blend out the edges so that it looks more like a highlight and not just this white bar. If you want an effect that is super shiny, I'm going to show you guys a 3-color highlight method that I first introduced in my how to illustrate shiny fabrics tutorial. In that one, I showed you guys in marker, but the techniques are the same. Okay, you're going to have a minimum of 3 colors. You're going to have this really light color where it is in between white and the color, your base color, whether it's the color of your fabric or, you know, the color of your cylinder, and you're going to color paint around your highlight. So I'm leaving that white bar there as the highlight, and each side is going to be the highlight color. Okay, because highlights, they don't sit like a white bar. They always have that transition color, and that really light pink is the transition color. And then I take my shadow color and I put in the shadow. When students have a hard time finding where to place highlights, not so much on a cylinder like this, but on a more complicated garment, on a maybe more twisted croquis figure, I recommend that they put in their shadows first because they are generally more practiced in laying down shadows. And so they'll put down the shadows and then be like, all right, opposite the shadows should be where the highlights are, right? So if you shadow on the bottom half of the bust, the top half of the bust gets the highlight. Okay? If the left side gets the shadow, then the right side gets the highlight, like that. Right? So I'm, you're like, what are you doing, Zoe? I'm like, I'm blowing on it so I can dry, because I want both those layers to be dry mostly before I layer this third color on top. And this third color is your base color. So the actual color of your fabric or whatever it is you're trying to paint. I layer it on top of the shadow just so I get a smoother transition and everything looks more harmonious. I'm gonna go in there on this side because you know highlights and shadows don't sit at the very edge, but a little bit away from the edge. And now I'm taking a clean brush with the water squeezed out mostly and softening that transition edge. You can add like a stripe of a color in between if you want a more graphic, kind of stripy look, or you can softly blend in that edge for a softer, more blended look. I love how redundant I'm being in this video. If you found this video helpful, please hit the thumbs up button. You know, I recently hit 25,000 subscribers, and I know I have you all to thank for sharing my videos. And yeah, please share this video with anyone who uses watercolors, whether they're just a hobbyist watercolorist or someone who does general illustration or fashion illustration. These tips can work for a variety of different kinds of artists and illustrators. So thank you for all the sharing you've done in the past. If you found this video helpful, please continue sharing my videos in the future. As always, if your first one sucks, you're right on track, so keep practicing, and I will see you in the next video.